What is up, designers and design nerds? Welcome to another episode of Design Discipline. My name is Mehmet Aydın Baytaş. I'm a scholar of design, and today we're going to talk about tools for visual design. Those of you who have met me before or have been following my writings on designdiscipline.com or listening to the conversations that I've been having with leaders, designers, creatives, and scholars on the Design Discipline podcast will be aware that I am a big fan of writing. I think language and written communication is one of the most important technologies that has ever been invented by humans. A lot of scholars, like historians or anthropologists, would argue that our species, humankind, is able to dominate the world, dominate this planet, because we alone are able to communicate with each other at scale about both real and imaginary things. We can tell each other stories and explain complicated ideas through words and writing. But since long before we could read and write or even talk, we have been relying on visual perception and visual information to survive. Today, there are scientific studies which imply that we process images at a rate that is 10 times or 15 times faster than words. But even this actually understates the power of visual perception because the information content in images is so much more than words. This biological fact is the foundation of all design disciplines. Even designers who deal with intangible things like strategy or experience or sound must rely on the fundamental skill of visual communication to get their point across and to do their work, to use the tools that they use for their purposes. Today in this episode, we are going to explore some very fundamental tools for visual communication and information visualization. And we're going to do this by reviewing the work and ideas by the designer Jack Butcher, who is famous for his brand Visualize Value. Jack is a designer and artist who has been gaining fame in the last couple of years, and perhaps no other living designer leverages visual communication in the same way that he does. His brand, called Visualize Value, was born from his skill in crafting professional presentations and visualizing strategy. When he was able to package his craft into bite-sized, shareable posts with a sharp visual style on Twitter and Instagram, he gained the attention of millions. And by tuning into the culture and needs of his audience, by applying design thinking, he was able to create a line of information products which brought him millions of dollars in revenue. I think it's safe to say that Jack is turning visual design in its purest form into a business and a community and an institution. And it's no secret that we at Design Discipline look up to Visualize Value in Jack Butcher. Our vision at Design Discipline, as well as our design tactics, are heavily informed by Visualize Value, and it's about time that we turn our attention to how these designs are made. What I will show you in this video is a set of 12 visual communication devices that Jack Butcher uses to create his acclaimed visuals at Visualize Value. For all kinds of designers, regardless of your particular discipline, these are some of the most fundamental tools that you must not only recognize, but you must also master. And for non-designers, for the rest of us, these are powerful tools that can improve your presentations and reports and your marketing and let you stand out from everyone else. Most of this content in this breakdown is actually derived from Jack Butcher's inaugural online course called How to Visualize Value. I took this course when it came out because at the same time I was researching how to build online courses. But even as an experienced designer, I found clarity and tools that help me with visual creation and also teaching and explaining things to people. You can expect to find all of this material and much more in that course, and if you purchase it using our affiliate link in the description, you will also help support Design Discipline. Anyhow, let's get to the 12 tools that I want to tell you about. I'm going to try to explain them to you using examples from Visualize Value, but also in terms of how they relate to our biology, our culture, and other universal truths about our world. Scale. The first of our visual communication devices is scale. Scale can convey quantity, order, significance, respect, and so much more, because when we see objects that differ in size, we kind of intuitively understand how they relate to each other in terms of volume and mass. But beyond physics and the conceptual world, scale can also communicate order, significance, respect, and so much more. One Visualize Value example that demonstrates scale very well is this quote from Epictetus. Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. Here we can see that the two containers, the two round objects, one of them small and one of them large, actually kind of have the same volume of light or white space inside of them. But one of them also carries a lot of darkness or emptiness, which communicates to us that maybe that's not the most desirable state. Think of many things, but do one. This is another example that demonstrates the power of scale, which is to say that when you concentrate on one thing, when you pool your effort into one outcome, then it's easier to make progress and make significant achievements in that particular field. Comparison. The second tool that Jack uses a lot is comparison. Now, when you put two or more objects side by side in the same graphic frame, it invokes a sense of comparison. It highlights both similarities and differences between the two. This is a simple but very powerful effect, and technically it's called juxtaposition. It's employed to great effect by philosophers, orators, public speakers, by architects, by artists, and filmmakers across the board. I think this example from Visualized Value illustrates it very well, where the three images are supposed to symbolize what is thought, what is said, and what is heard. And you can see how between what you think, what you try to communicate, and what is actually received by your interlocutor, the meaning or the content actually diminishes. And it's very intuitive to realize this when these three visuals are presented side by side. And this is one of my favorites from Visualized Value, comparing the perfectionist who achieves a little bit, the procrastinator who never gets anything done, and the iterator who's able to go off the charts. Metaphor. Generations before we could talk, before we had language, we used symbols to express ourselves. In fact, there's a field of study, a discipline called semiotics, where we study this subject, we study symbols, and this is perhaps the most expansive, the largest one among all of the intersections between design, science, and philosophy. The important thing in visual design is to know which symbols are effective to use and which ones you should avoid. And here, unfortunately, there are no shortcuts because our culture, our symbols evolve perpetually. They are forever changing. So the only way to acquire mastery over symbols and symbolism is to be a lifelong student of visual culture. This visual from Jack Butcher is another one of my favorites, where he illustrates the difference between the truth and fact and bias, our filter in what we perceive, and then ultimately the perception or the concept that we actually understand. Another one that illustrates symbolism is this one, where he uses the metaphor of a user interface, a dialog box that you would click on to illustrate one of life's grand choices between complaining about something and acting to change it. This third example tells us that all happiness depends upon courage and work, and the curve of a smile, drawn here in a very abstract way, communicates to us that this is all about happiness, it's about contentment. That's the core idea. Pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is fundamental to how the human brain works. In fact, a lot of neuroscientists describe the human brain as a prediction machine. And in visual design, patterns give us the power to communicate without actually saying anything, without speaking, because given enough history, the human brain is able to extrapolate and fill in the blanks. We're also quick to recognize what goes against the pattern, what stands out, as we can see in this illustration of a quote. A dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it. Pattern recognition also allows us to infer universal truths or algorithms from a limited set of data. Here, the numbers let us compare the outcome of a linear process based on addition versus the outcome of a process based on multiplication. And we're able to intuitively understand what's going to happen if we keep going with this process or if we substitute different numbers or different values in its place. Flow. Now close your eyes and picture a timeline. Try to visualize what a timeline means to you. And the chances are it's going to flow from left to right because this is how we read and this is how we kind of naturally visualize how things move. Now take your hand and make a gesture that means there. Chances are you're right-handed because 90% of us are, and then the gesture occurs left to right because that's how your hand moves outward from your body. What I'm trying to say is that our anatomy informs not only how we act in the world, but also how we perceive it. Most of us read left to right because of this, and we leverage this habit to visualize time. When we see a graphic like this, visualizing an iterative process, we immediately understand that things are flowing left to right. The passage of time is from the kind of squiggly, irregular shape towards the perfect shape, occurring through multiple iterations. This one that tells us to slow down for the sake of clarity doesn't need to use any arrows or numbers or anything like that to communicate to us the order in which these three states happen. And this one that tells us to keep going despite some unmotivated moments doesn't need any special care to tell us that it's the state on the right, the higher state, that we will end up in. Stacking. When we build things in the physical world, we kind of layer things one on top of each other, and it's natural to use supporting structures that are wider and heavier than the load that they are carrying. So think about the pyramids, for example. The peaks of these structures are naturally less spacious, and they're more challenging to reach than the lower levels. As a visual device, stacking communicates hierarchy, challenge, movement, but also sequence, because in order to reach the peak of a structure, it's necessary to climb or build through the steps in a particular order. This example for visualized value compares the impact of a generalist and the specialist who is able to achieve higher and make a sharper impact through specialization. And this one tells us about the hierarchy between needs, wants, and vibes. We intuitively understand from this picture that we first have to take care of our needs and devote most of our time and attention to those. And after that comes the wants, and then the vibes. This is a more subtle one that employs the pyramid structure together with comparison to illustrate the difference between a thinker whose thoughts might be kind of buried underground or buried the surface, even though they are voluminous and rich, compared to the recognition and higher achievement that you can get as a writer or someone that expresses, materializes their ideas in the world. Continuum. Humans are naturally inclined to think in terms of dichotomies, so it's light against dark, good against evil, liberal against conservative. It's easy to make sense of the world this way, but the real world is a lot more nuanced and a lot more complicated than this, and continua help us visualize and appreciate the shades of gray between the black and the white. This visualization is useful to compare more than two things based on a single attribute. This visualization of a quote from Dieter Rams, saying less but better, illustrates between the left and the right sides the difference between spreading thin and doing many things at once and concentrating on one thing alone. And here's again a more subtle one illustrating a quote from Seneca. What you think is the summit is only a step up. The summit that we're able to see, perhaps the one that we're standing on, is visualized as but a small slice of a whole range of achievements, big and small. The Venn diagram. The Venn diagram is an indispensable tool of mathematics and logic. We all learn about this as kids in school. We visualize intersections and differences of different categories and sets. But as a symbol, the Venn diagram can also communicate the fundamentals about our social life, senses of belonging, of sharing, of coming together, but also exclusivity and standing out. In Jack Butcher's work, sometimes the Venn visualization is used in subtle ways, like in this one, where he illustrates the difference between truth and perception. It makes the case that sometimes we are outside observers, we are not part of the phenomenon, and our understanding of things can therefore be limited. Here's another subtle one. Art is not what you see, but what you make others see, showing how when perceptions come together, when different actors in a culture come together, that's when our work and our art acquires meaning. This final example is a little more obvious. The quote here is what you can imagine depends on what you know, and the picture shows how it's important to connect the larger bubbles of imagination to the smaller bubbles of knowledge. Hierarchy. The classic organizational chart is best known for helping us manage companies or to visualize family trees, but hierarchies and cascades are natural parts of the world, and it also allows us to see process. Think of a family tree that can help us appreciate our origins and lineage, but also trees of ideas that show us where they're coming from and how they branch out from each other. The tree visualization also tells us about a process or order, as we see in the illustration of this quote. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. There's a couple of choices that we can make, but the result here is always the same. We also see through a hierarchical visualization how opportunities or choices or a process can expand, as we see in this illustration of a quote from Sun Tzu. Opportunities multiply as they are seized. The Cartesian plots. Let's imagine we have two variables. We have x and we have y. How does y change when we change x? This is actually the essential question of all science in our modern world. The Cartesian plot is essential in all of science and engineering, and it allows us to see sometimes non-intuitive relations between variables and entities in all of life's domains. It helps us truly make sense of input and output relationships and make purposeful decisions. Now, when you learn about Cartesian plots in school, and as I've used in my example, sometimes you draw the x and y axes on the picture, but you don't really have to, because as we've seen before, we can intuitively make sense of things going from left to right pointer from bottom to top. This visual shows us the idea of compound interest, the idea that the results of something can be exponential, even when the inputs are happening in a linear fashion, one by one, as long as you're making them consistently. And the Cartesian plot showing the movement of a variable over time can also help us slice it into pieces and visualize changes over time, the changes in an algorithm or the process that makes something happen. Loops. Now, linear stories are easy to understand, but life is seldom that simple. A lot of things in life happen in cycles. This is true for nature as well as human ventures. Things move in cycles and in feedback loops. What goes around comes around. The sun always sets and then it rises. This piece from Visualize Value illustrates the power of iteration and refinement and putting time into something with another quote from Epictetus. No great thing is created suddenly, but sometimes it's not good to be stuck in a loop. This one says, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. Being stuck in the cycle of explaining and talking about an idea constantly is not going to serve us as much as practicing it. The spectrum. The last one of our design tools is the spectral visualization, where we can map out and plot together multiple attributes of the same thing in a continuum, and it helps us break down and compare complex things. Seeing things in black and white is easy, but nature is always full of many colors, and the spectral visualization is useful for seeing those nuances, comparing ideas along multiple dimensions, and allowing us to deal with complex and multifaceted topics. This piece from Jack Butcher says, don't compare yourself to anything but yourself. You don't have the data. It shows us how we go through multiple actions, multiple states every day. We achieve some things and we fail at others, and life is very complicated, so we don't really know the sum total of what anyone else is feeling. It's useless to make singular comparisons because life is so nuanced and multidimensional. I hope you enjoyed this compilation of visual communication devices. I use these tools all the time when I'm making visuals for design discipline, when I'm making presentations or pitch decks, even when I'm designing user interfaces, when I'm designing websites. As I said in the beginning, for designers, these are some of the most fundamental tools. But even for non-designers, as we go about our daily lives and we're making documents for schools and presentations for our business, these are some of the tools that will help us make sense of things and help us get our ideas across to the other people that we're surrounded with. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure that you will enjoy other releases from Design Discipline as well. So go ahead and like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to the Design Discipline podcast, follow us on Twitter and Instagram as @DesignDiscipline, and head over to our website, designdiscipline.com, to access the full range of our resources and offerings. And I'll see you in the next episode.